What happens when this person you profile, harass, and humiliate is the one person who holds your entire multi-billion-dollar company in the palm of their hand? This isn't a hypothetical. This is the story of how a single ugly moment of prejudice at a boarding gate triggered a chain reaction that threatened to ground an entire airline. It's a story about a quiet, unassuming man named Dr. Nolan Pierce and the powerful, world-altering secret hidden in his wallet. A secret that a stressed-out gate agent named Karen Miller was about to uncover in the worst way imaginable, unleashing a storm of karma so severe it would make headlines. The air in Reagan National Airport's Terminal C had a familiar taste, a sterile cocktail of jet fuel Cinnabon and low-grade anxiety. It was the taste of travel, the flavor of hurry up and wait. For Dr. Nolan Pierce, it was simply the taste of another Tuesday. At 52, Nolan wore his experience not as a burden, but as a well-tailored suit. His salt and pepper hair was cut short and neat, his frame lean from a disciplined lifestyle. His charcoal gray suit was practical, not flashy, chosen for its ability to resist wrinkles during a cross-country flight. He stood in the Group 1 boarding lane for Ascend Air Flight 1124 to Dallas/Fort Worth, his leather briefcase in one hand, his boarding pass on his phone in the other. He was an island of calm in a river of controlled chaos. Business travelers fidgeted with their ties, families tried to wrangle toddlers who saw the boarding lane ropes as a jungle gym, and a low hum of conversation filled the cavernous space. Nolan simply stood, his gaze distant, his mind already 3 steps ahead. He was mentally rehearsing the opening protocols for the comprehensive flight standards and operations audit he was scheduled to lead at Ascend Air's corporate headquarters. It was a triennial review, a deep, invasive dive into the very soul of the airline, its safety procedures, its maintenance logs, its pilot training programs, its everything. It was a colossal undertaking, and his name was at the top of the charter. "Sir," the voice was sharp, laced with an impatience that cut through the ambient noise. Nolan blinked his focus, returning to the here and now. A gate agent, a woman with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read Karen, was staring at him. Her eyes magnified slightly by her glasses flicked from his face down to his simple, non-designer shoes, then back up. "This is the Group 1 boarding lane," she said, her tone implying he was either lost or stupid. "For our Ascend 1 elite members and first-class passengers." Nolan offered a polite, small smile. He was accustomed to this, the subtle challenges, the questioning glances. It was part of the landscape of his life. "Yes, I know. My boarding pass is for Group 1. He held up his phone, the screen displaying the digital pass with the bold Group 1 designation clearly visible. Karen Miller didn't look at the phone. She looked at him. She saw a black man in a plain suit standing in a line typically populated by executives in expensive tailoring and legacy travelers who practically lived in the sky. Her mind squeezed by the pressure of ensuring an on-time departure, a metric her manager Mark was rabid about, triaged the situation based on a set of deeply ingrained, unexamined biases. He didn't fit the pattern. "We're trying to keep the lanes clear for our priority passengers to ensure a smooth boarding process," she said, her voice growing louder, drawing the attention of others in the line. A few people shifted their weight uncomfortably. "The general boarding announcement hasn't been made yet. You'll need to step out of line." Nolan's smile faded. His posture remained relaxed, but a flicker of weariness crossed his face. "Ma'am, with all due respect, my pass says Group 1. You're welcome to scan it if you would like to verify." He kept his voice low professional. He hated scenes. His entire career was built on quiet observation and meticulous data-driven analysis, not public confrontation. But Karen Miller was on a power trip fueled by stress and prejudice. To her, his calm demeanor was a form of defiance. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. Please step aside. You're holding up the line." Now a few more heads turned. A man in a tailored blue suit behind Nolan cleared his throat. "For goodness sake, Karen, just scan the man's pass. We'd all like to get on the plane." Karen's face flushed a blotchy red, being called out by a passenger. A regular on this route she recognized was a direct challenge to her authority. She rounded on Nolan, her voice rising to a near shout. "Sir, if you refuse to follow my instructions, I will have to call security." This was the inflection point, the moment of choice. Nolan could escalate, raise his voice, and demand his rights. He could show them the credentials in his wallet that could make this woman's entire world crumble. But that wasn't his way. His power was a quiet, potent thing, not a cudgel to be swung in a terminal. He had a job to do in Dallas, a far more important job than winning a squabble at a boarding gate. "That won't be necessary," Nolan said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. It was the voice he used when delivering a critical finding in a boardroom. "But you are making a serious mistake." "Oh, I'm making a mistake," she scoffed, already waving a hand for the two airport police officers who stood observing near the desk. "The only mistake here is you thinking the rules don't apply to you." The officers, a young man and a middle-aged woman, approached. They looked bored, as if this was the 10th minor dispute they dealt with that morning. "Problem here, Karen?" the male officer asked. "Yes. This gentleman refuses to leave the priority boarding lane and is causing a disturbance." A disturbance. The word hung in the air, ugly and false. Nolan hadn't so much as raised his voice. He had been a model of stoicism. The female officer turned to Nolan. "Sir, can we see your boarding pass?" Finally, someone who asked for the evidence. Nolan showed her his phone. She glanced at it, then back at Karen. "It says, Group 1, Karen." Karen was committed now, her pride on the line. He could have faked it. A screenshot. "I need him to step aside until I can verify it in the system. I don't have time for this right now. We're going to miss our departure window." Nolan felt a profound sense of resignation. It was happening. Again. The quiet humiliation, the public spectacle. He saw the looks from the other passengers, a mix of pity, annoyance, and a few glimmers of disgust aimed at the gate agent. He was no longer Dr. Nolan Pierce, lead auditor for the Federal Aviation Administration. He was just a problem to be removed. "Sir, if you'd just come with us, we can get this sorted out at the desk." The male officer set his hand, gesturing vaguely. It wasn't an arrest, but it was a removal, an extraction. Nolan looked at the officers, at Karen's triumphant sneer, and at the faces in the crowd. He took a slow, deliberate breath. He could have ended it right there. One flash of his government ID, but a different idea began to form in his mind. An audit is about observing a system under normal and sometimes stressful conditions to see where it fails. And this system, Ascend Air's customer-facing system, was failing spectacularly. This wasn't just one employee. This was a cultural data point. And he was a man who collected data. Without another word, Nolan gave a single sharp nod. He turned and walked out of the boarding lane, the two officers flanking him like a shameful honor guard. He could feel the stares of 100 people on his back. He walked past the gate desk, where Karen's manager, Mark, was just coming out of the jet bridge, his face a mask of confusion. "What's going on, Karen?" "What was that?" Mark asked, watching the procession. "Just handling it, Mark," she said, a self-satisfied smile on her face, making sure we stay on schedule. Nolan was escorted to a small, cordoned-off seating area near the customer service desk. He sat down, placed his briefcase neatly on the floor beside him, and waited. He did not look angry. He did not look humiliated. He looked like a scientist who had just observed a fascinating, if predictable, chemical reaction. The experiment was underway, and the results he suspected were going to be explosive. Mark Logan, the station manager for Ascend Air at DCA, watched Nolan Pierce with a growing sense of unease. He was a man who understood the delicate ecosystem of the airport. He knew that disturbances, especially those involving security, created ripples. Ripples meant reports. Reports meant his boss, Richard Sterling, the VP of North American Operations, would be asking questions. And Mark's primary professional goal was to keep Richard Sterling from asking questions. "Karen, talk to me," he said, approaching the gate desk, his voice low and urgent. "What happened? We have a flight to board." "I handled it, Mark." Karen repeated, her chin still high. "Some guy was in the Group 1 line, clearly didn't belong there. He got belligerent when I asked him to move, so I had security escort him out. Standard procedure." Belligerent Mark pressed his eyes, narrowing. The man sitting over there with the posture of a chess grandmaster didn't look belligerent. He looked patient, dangerously patient. He was shouting, well, not shouting, but his tone? He was very defiant. It was a whole scene. Mark's internal alarm bells were screaming. A whole scene was code. He knew Karen. He knew she had a short fuse and a tendency to see challenges to her authority where none existed. He also knew she had been written up twice for customer complaints. "Let me see his booking," Mark said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Karen's confidence wavered for a fraction of a second. She tapped furiously at her keyboard, her knuckles white. A moment later, the passenger details for Nolan Pierce appeared on her screen. Her face went slack. Pierce Nolan. J seat 2. First status, Ascend 1. Concierge key. Fare class, F full fare. Unrestricted ticket, purchased by U.S. government, DEPT, of transportation. It was the highest possible echelon of passenger. A full fare first-class seat, bought by the government. A concierge key-level flyer, a status so rare it was almost mythical, reserved for people who spent astronomical sums or held immense influence. A status that meant they were to be treated like royalty. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The screen glowed with her colossal error. She hadn't just inconvenienced a passenger, she had harassed one of their most valuable and, given the depth of transportation note, potentially influential customers. "Oh, God," she whispered. Mark looked at the screen over her shoulder, and the color drained from his face. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. "Karen," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "What did you do?" He didn't wait for an answer. He spun on his heel and walked briskly over to where Nolan was sitting. The two police officers were standing nearby, looking increasingly like they'd been duped into participating in a high-stakes corporate blunder. "Mr. Pierce," Mark began, his voice slick with a practiced, desperate politeness. "I am so sorry. My name is Mark Logan. I'm the station manager here. There has been a terrible misunderstanding." Nolan looked up from the spot on the wall he'd been studying. His expression was neutral, revealing nothing. "Has there?" "Yes, absolutely. My agent, she's been under a lot of pressure. On-time departures, you know how it is. She made a mistake, a grievous mistake. Please let me personally escort you onto the plane. We'll get you settled in." "Can I get you a drink of coffee before we board?" Nolan didn't move. He simply looked at Mark, his gaze steady and analytical. "Your agent didn't make a mistake, Mr. Logan. She made a choice. She saw me, she made an assumption, and she chose to escalate the situation rather than verify the facts. She chose public humiliation over a simple 2-second scan of a boarding pass." Mark swallowed hard. The practice corporate apology was failing. This man wasn't interested in platitudes. "I understand your frustration, sir, and I assure you I will be dealing with Karen personally. There will be retraining." Nolan almost smiled. Retraining. The corporate euphemism for a slap on the wrist that everyone forgets in a week. The issue, Mr. Logan, is not just with Karen. It's with a system that empowers an employee like her to act on her prejudices without checks or balances. It's a culture. You said it yourself. She's under pressure for on-time departures. So customer dignity is sacrificed for a metric. Is that Ascend Air's official policy? He was dissecting them, calmly, precisely, with the skill of a surgeon. Mark felt sweat beading on his forehead. This was spiraling. "No, of course not. That's not who we are," Mark stammered. It was time. Nolan decided the observation phase was over. It was time to present the initial findings. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a slim black leather wallet. He didn't flip it open to his driver's license. He opened it to the other side, the side with the gold shield and the imposing eagle. He held it out for Mark to see. Federal Aviation Administration, Nolan J. Pierce, Lead Aviation Safety Inspector, National Audit Team, Lead Mark Logan, stared at the credentials. The gold shield seemed to pulse under the fluorescent lights. The words swam before his eyes. Lead Aviation Safety Inspector, National Audit Team Lead. His mind frantically connected the dots. The audit, the big one, the one corporate had been preparing for 6 months. He had seen the name on the preliminary memos, Pierce. He had assumed it was some faceless bureaucrat he'd never have to meet. He looked from the ID back to Nolan's calm, unreadable face. The man he had just allowed his employee to publicly shame wasn't just a VIP. He was the man who was about to hold the fate of Ascend Air in his hands for the next 3 weeks. He was the lead inquisitor, the judge, the jury. Mark felt a wave of nausea so intense he thought he might be sick, right there on the polished terminal floor. This wasn't a ripple. This was a tsunami. "Oh no." Mark breathed the sound barely audible. The 2 police officers glancing over his shoulder saw the ID. The young man's eyes went wide, and he took an involuntary step back. They hadn't just removed a passenger, they'd impeded a federal officer in an airport. The potential ramifications were dizzying. Nolan tucked his wallet back into his pocket. "As I was saying, Mr. Logan, this has been a very educational experience, a valuable data point on the culture of your organization before the audit has even officially commenced. I find that observing a system in its natural state often yields the most honest results." His voice was still quiet, but now it carried the weight of the entire United States Code of Federal Regulations. Now Nolan continued, standing up and smoothing the front of his jacket. "I would like to get on my flight. I have a meeting in Dallas to prepare for." He looked Mark directly in the eye. "I believe I'll be seeing your boss, Richard Sterling, first thing tomorrow morning." Mark could only nod his mouth agape. He felt like a fish on a hook. He turned and saw Karen watching them from the gate, her face a mask of pale, dawning horror. She had seen the wallet. She couldn't read the words, but she saw the shield. She saw the look on her manager's face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. Nolan Pierce, without another glance at them, picked up his briefcase and began to walk toward the jet bridge. The remaining passengers in the Group 1 lane parted for him like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of awe and shock. The man in the blue suit, who had spoken up for him, gave a slow, appreciative nod. As Nolan stepped into the quiet, carpeted cocoon of the jet bridge, he heard Mark's panicked, hissing voice behind him. "Karen, get Richard Sterling on the phone, now. Tell him we have a code black. No, a code Armageddon. Just get him on the phone." The door to the aircraft hissed open. Nolan stepped inside, greeted by a flight attendant whose practiced smile was oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Pierce," she said cheerfully. "Thank you, Nolan," replied his voice betraying nothing. "I'm looking forward to the flight." But as he settled into seat 2A, the plush leather, a stark contrast to the hard plastic of the terminal chairs, he wasn't thinking about the flight. He was thinking about the audit. What had begun as a routine, albeit massive review, had just become something else entirely. It had become personal, but his professionalism demanded he transmute the personal insult into professional rigor. He would not be vindictive. He would be thorough. He would be relentless. He would take every observation, every data point, starting with Karen Miller's ugly assumption, and he would follow the thread no matter where it led. And he had a sinking feeling it was going to lead somewhere very, very dark. The Ascend Air corporate headquarters, a gleaming glass and steel monolith just outside DFW, was designed to project an image of sleek, modern efficiency. But on Wednesday morning, the atmosphere inside the executive wing was thick, with a tension that no state-of-the-art HVAC system could disperse. Richard Sterling, the VP of North American Operations, stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office, staring at the silver planes taxiing on the tarmac below. He wasn't admiring them. He was seeing them as million-dollar liabilities. Sterling was a man sculpted by corporate ambition. His suit was Italian, his watch Swiss, and his smile a carefully calibrated weapon. But the frantic call from Mark Logan the previous day had shattered his composure. He had spent the entire night on damage control calls with legal HR and corporate communications. They had a plan: apologize profusely, isolate the gate agent, offer concessions, contain the fallout. He turned as his assistant announced their arrival. "Mr. Sterling, Dr. Pierce, and his team are here." Nolan Pierce walked in, followed by two other inspectors. A sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s named Maria Flores, an expert in maintenance records, and a younger man, Ben Carter, whose specialty was crew training and certification. They carried nothing but slim briefcases. They didn't need boxes of files. They had the authority to access everything. Nolan looked exactly as Sterling had imagined from Mark's terrified description, composed, impassive, and radiating an aura of untouchable authority. Dr. Pierce Sterling said, striding forward, his hand outstretched, his face arranged in an expression of grave sincerity. "Richard Sterling, on behalf of the entire Ascend Air family, I want to offer my deepest, most profound apologies for the incident at DCA. It was inexcusable. It was an appalling failure on our part, and I assure you we have already taken decisive action." Nolan shook his hand. The grip was firm, brief. He did not return the smile. "Mr. Sterling, let's be clear. Your internal personnel matters are your own. My team and I are here to conduct the triennial flight standards audit as chartered by the FAA. That is our sole focus. Shall we begin?" The dismissal was so clean, so absolute, it left Sterling momentarily speechless. He had expected a tirade, a negotiation, a list of demands. He had prepared for an emotional confrontation. He was utterly unprepared for this cold, surgical professionalism. It was like trying to punch fog. Of course, Sterling managed recovering quickly. "We are an open book. My team has prepared the conference room for you. Anything you need, documents, personnel access to facilities, it's yours. We appreciate the cooperation," Nolan said, his tone suggesting he expected nothing less. "We'll begin with maintenance logs for the 737 MAX fleet, cross-referenced with flight crew reports and parts procurement invoices for the last 24 months. Ms. Flores will handle that. Mr. Carter will require the complete training records and certification histories for all pilots and flight engineers hired in the last 3 years. And I will need to speak with your head of system operations control." The requests were standard, yet the specificity and immediacy of them felt like the opening moves of a devastating chess game. Sterling and his team of assembled executives could only nod and scramble to comply. The audit began. The large, sterile conference room became the FAA's command center. For the first 2 days, Nolan and his team worked with a quiet, relentless intensity. They didn't make accusations. They asked questions. They connected dots. Maria Flores, hunched over a bank of monitors, found the first anomaly. "Nolan, take a look at this," she said, not looking up from her screen. Nolan and Ben walked over. "What have you got?" Nolan asked. "A ghost in the machine," Maria said. "Here's the maintenance log for aircraft N921AX, signed off on a C-check 2 months ago at the Chicago Maintenance Hub. All green." But here she clicked a few keys, bringing up another window. "Is the parts procurement invoice for the primary hydraulic actuator they supposedly replaced. It was ordered, but the invoice was cancelled 2 days later. There's no record of it ever being delivered or installed." Ben Carter whistled softly. "So they signed off on a replacement that never happened. It gets better," Maria continued. "I cross-referenced it with flight crew reports. In the 6 weeks following that maintenance, there have been 4 separate write-ups by pilots on this exact aircraft for sluggish rudder response on approach. All 4 were dismissed by ground maintenance as transient software glitches with a no-fault found designation." Nolan stared at the screen, his expression unreadable, but inside a cold certainty was taking hold. This was it. The thread. The incident at the gate with Karen Miller wasn't an isolated case of bad judgment. It was a symptom of a much deeper disease, a corporate culture that prioritized appearance over substance, metrics over reality. A culture that would pressure a gate agent to profile a passenger to ensure an on-time departure was the same culture that would pressure a mechanic to pencil whip a safety check to get a plane back in the air faster. "It's a pattern," Nolan said, his voice low. "They're not fixing the problems. They're managing the paperwork. One plane could be a fluke," Ben cautioned. "One lazy mechanic." "Then we look for more," Nolan said. Maria pulled the logs for every aircraft that went through a C-check in Chicago and Dallas in the last year. Cross-reference all major parts replacements with procurement and shipping manifests. "Ben, I want you to start interviewing the pilots who filed those reports. Don't tell them what we're looking for. Just ask them to walk you through the incidents. See if their stories align." The audit intensified. The atmosphere in the Ascend Air headquarters shifted from nervous tension to palpable fear. Sterling's attempts to be a gracious host ceased. He and his executives huddled in their offices like generals in a besieged bunker. They had given the FAA the keys to the kingdom, and now they could only watch as their most damning secrets were unearthed. By the end of the first week, Maria had found 17 other instances of similar discrepancies. Aircraft signed off as fully repaired, while the parts needed for those repairs were never installed. Ben's interviews with the pilots were even more chilling. Many of them felt their concerns were being ignored, dismissed by a maintenance division that was under immense pressure from management to keep planes flying. They spoke of a growing frustration and a sense of being gaslit by their own company. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on a Friday afternoon. Nolan was in a windowless room in the sub-basement reviewing the records for the System Operations Control Center, the nerve center that manages every Ascend air flight in the air. He was looking at dispatcher logs, specifically how they responded to in-flight maintenance flags. He found a recurring directive, Directive 7B. In the event of non-critical intermittent fault indicators, flight crews are advised to monitor and cycle the system. Defer maintenance right-up until arrival at a primary maintenance hub, ORD-DFW, to avoid downline delays. It was a smoking gun. It was official written policy. The company was actively instructing pilots to ignore potential warning signs to avoid flight delays. It was a policy that saved money and kept the on-time performance statistics looking pristine. It was also a policy that put the lives of every single passenger and crew member at risk. Nolan leaned back in his chair. He thought of the flight he had taken from DCA. He thought of the families, the business travelers, the hundreds of people blissfully unaware of the institutional rot that festered beneath the shiny silver skin of the aircraft carrying them through the sky. He thought of Karen Miller, so proud of her authority, so confident in her judgment, a tiny, ignorant cog in a massive, failing machine. His personal humiliation at the gate felt like a distant memory, a triviality. This was no longer about karma for one woman or one manager. This was about public safety on a national scale. The audit had started because of a man being profiled. It was now about to ground an airline because of a culture of negligence that he had refused to ignore. He picked up his phone and called his direct superior at the FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Director Nolan said, his voice steady, "It's Pierce. I'm formally requesting we expand the scope of the Ascend Air audit. And I'm advising you that we may need to issue a preliminary grounding order for their 737 MAX fleet pending immediate full-scale inspections. I have reason to believe there is a clear and present danger to air safety." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The director knew what a request like that meant. It was the nuclear option. "What have you found, Nolan?" the director asked, his voice grim. "A culture of lies," Nolan replied, "and I have the paperwork to prove it." The news that the FAA was not only expanding the audit, but actively considering a fleet-wide grounding order did not just ripple through the Ascend Air executive suite, it detonated. The sleek minimalist decor of Richard Sterling's corner office suddenly felt like a cage. The carefully cultivated image of calm corporate control evaporated, replaced by the raw animal panic of a man watching his empire and his life burn to the ground on a live feed. His first move, instinctual and vicious, was to sever the limbs to save the head. He didn't even make the calls himself. He barked an order at a terrified HR executive. Cut them loose. Now. No severance, no discussion. Karen Miller received the news via a cold, impersonal email that landed in her inbox with the finality of a guillotine. The subject line was simply, "Termination of employment." The body cited gross misconduct, and a failure to adhere to the core values of the Ascend Air family. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. Mark Logan, the station manager, was suspended indefinitely, pending an internal investigation, a corporate purgatory from which no one ever returned. They were sacrifices offered up to the angry gods at the FAA in a desperate, pathetic bid for mercy. But Nolan Pierce was not a god to be appeased with token offerings. He was an auditor, and he dealt in facts, not sacrifices. The blood in the water only made him swim faster. Sterling's second move was to fight back with the only weapons he truly understood, influence and spin. He locked himself in his office, tie, loosened jacket, slung over a chair, and worked the phones like a man possessed. His voice, usually a smooth baritone of command, became a high-pitched, strained weapon of desperation. He called lobbyists on K Street, whose children's private school tuitions he had indirectly paid for years. He called a former college roommate who was now a congressman on the Transportation Committee. He called anyone and everyone who owed him a favor. The story he spun was a masterpiece of corporate victimhood. The man is on a vendetta bill he'd plead, pacing the length of his office. It's a personal crusade over a minor customer service issue, a misunderstanding at the gate. He's using the full weight of the federal government to settle a personal score. This isn't about safety, it's about his bruised ego. He's threatening to ground an entire fleet, put thousands of people out of work because one of my agents had a bad day. Some of his contacts were initially sympathetic. They made the requisite promises to make some inquiries and look into it. But within hours, the callbacks started coming, and the tone had shifted from friendly concern to icy distance. The brick wall they hit at the FAA was absolute. The message relayed secondhand back to Sterling was always the same, delivered in the unyielding monotone of officialdom. Dr. Pierce's team has uncovered significant and credible evidence of systemic safety failures. This is now a matter of national air safety. The audit will proceed as Dr. Pierce sees fit, without interference. The political escape route was sealed. He was trapped in the burning building with the fire inspector. Sterling slammed the phone down, his hand trembling. He was no longer just fighting for his bonus or his company's stock price. He was fighting for his freedom. Directive 7B. The policy of deferring maintenance write-ups had been his signature achievement. He'd received accolades for it. He'd called it a paradigm-shifting efficiency model in the annual report. Now that paradigm was about to shift him right out of his job, and he was beginning to fear into a federal courtroom. While Sterling was fighting a political war, Nolan Pierce and his team were quietly gathering the ammunition that would make that war unwinnable. Ben Carter's interviews with the pilots had done more than just collect data. They had opened a floodgate of frustration. A whisper network had ignited among the flight crews. The quiet, professional man from the FAA was asking the right questions. He was listening. Finally, someone was listening. A veteran captain, a man named Dave Sully O'Connell, with 30 years in the cockpit and a face like a roadmap of every crosswind he'd ever fought, reached out through a trusted intermediary. He insisted on a meeting off-site, no phones, cash for the coffee. They met in a nondescript diner miles from the airport, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and the lingering smell of bacon. Captain O'Connell, a broad-shouldered man with eyes that had seen too many sunrises from 35,000 feet, looked less like a pilot and more like a weary union boss preparing for a strike. He slid a plain manila envelope across the Formica tabletop. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. "I heard what you're looking into," O'Connell said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the clatter of plates. "You're not just on the right track, you're on the express train to the truth. This place, this company, has been putting numbers before people for years. We've been screaming about it in reports, in meetings, in quiet conversations, in the crew lounge, and they either ignore you or they gaslight you. They call you paranoid, tell you you're not a team player. They make you feel like you're the crazy one for caring about a landing gear that groans a little too loud." He leaned forward, his voice dropping further. 2 months ago, a first officer on the Phoenix to Chicago route had a stick shaker activate on final approach, a stall warning. Terrifying. He followed procedure, executed a go-around, landed safely. The report he filed was buried. The plane was back in service 6 hours later. No fault found. We all know what that means. It means they didn't want to find the fault. It would have delayed the morning departures. Nolan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He opened the envelope. Inside were not just documents, but a chronicle of willful negligence. There were printouts of internal emails, dispatcher logs, and memos. The subject lines told a chilling story. Excessive maintenance delays, improving aircraft utilization rates, action required, new in-flight fault reporting protocol. And then he saw it, the final email in the stack, the holy grail of malfeasance. It was from Richard Sterling himself, sent from his personal account to the heads of maintenance and operations. "Team," it began, the tone chummy and conspiratorial. "Let me be blunt. The board is not satisfied with our Q3 aircraft utilization numbers. We are lagging behind our competitors. The primary drag on our efficiency is downline maintenance delays. Directive 7B is not a suggestion, it is a mandate. I expect to see a 15% reduction in maintenance-related delays by the end of this quarter. I don't care how you do it. Juggle the schedules, streamline the paperwork, whatever it takes. Make the numbers work. The planes need to be in the air, not in the hangar. Let's not let perfect be the enemy of profitable. Let's not let perfect be the enemy of profitable." The phrase hung in Nolan's mind obscene in its casual cynicism. It was the entire rotten culture of Ascend Air distilled into 8 words. It was the philosophy that led to a falsified maintenance log for a hydraulic actuator in Chicago. It was the philosophy that led a gate agent in Washington to believe that removing a paying passenger was more efficient than a 2-second scan of his ticket. It was the Rosetta Stone of their corruption. "This is a confession," Nolan said, his voice barely a whisper, imbued with the gravity of the discovery. "We call it the Sterling Doctrine," Captain O'Connell he'd a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Fly till it breaks, then hope it breaks on the ground. Thank you for listening to us, Dr. Pierce. You're the first person with the power to do something who actually has." Armed with the Sterling Doctrine, Nolan knew the time for quiet analysis was over. It was time for the final presentation. It was time for the hammer to fall. He requested a final mandatory meeting with the entire Ascend Air Executive Board, including the CEO, Alan Maxwell, a man who had remained serenely insulated from the daily grind of the audit. The meeting was set for the following morning in the main corporate boardroom on the top floor, a room designed to intimidate with a panoramic view of the kingdom it ruled. The atmosphere was arctic. Sterling Maxwell and a half-dozen other pale-faced VPs sat on one side of a massive, polished mahogany table that felt more like a barrier. On the other sat Nolan, Maria, and Ben, their 3 slim briefcases in front of them, An arsenal of facts. Nolan began. He did not raise his voice. He did not mention the incident at DCA. He didn't need to. That was a personal insult. This was a public execution. He simply laid out the facts, his voice, the calm, methodical instrument of a surgeon about to make a deep incision. He projected the first slide, the maintenance log for aircraft N921AX, signed off and green. Then the next slide, the procurement invoice for the part that was never purchased. Then another and another. 17 instances laid out in a damning procession of fraud. With each slide, each piece of evidence, another layer of Ascend Air's plausible deniability was meticulously stripped away. Then Maria Flores took over, her sharp, precise voice explaining the pilot write-ups for in-flight issues that directly correlated with the falsified maintenance. Ben Carter followed, detailing how the training protocols emphasized deferring to ground crew decisions, effectively silencing pilot concerns. It was a symphony of negligence conducted by Nolan. Finally, he came to Directive 7B. This directive, Nolan said, letting the words hang in the silent room, is not just a violation of dozens of FAA regulations. It is a fundamental betrayal of the trust that every single passenger places in this airline when they step onto one of your aircraft. It is a policy of institutionalized, systemic negligence. Richard Sterling, cornered, sweating, and seeing his life flashing before his eyes, finally broke. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is a distortion, a complete mischaracterization. You are taking a simple efficiency initiative and twisting it into something sinister. Dr. Pierce has had a vendetta against this company from day one because of a misunderstanding at the gate. This is personal. The CEO, Alan Maxwell, a man used to smooth presentations and positive projections, looked from Sterling's frantic face to Nolan's unnervingly calm one. "Is this true, Dr. Pierce?" he asked, his voice strained. "Is any of this personal?" Nolan paused. He let the accusation hang in the air, allowing every person in the room to contemplate it. He looked directly at Richard Sterling, whose face was now a blotchy mess of red and white. Then he turned his cool, steady gaze to the CEO. "Mr. Maxwell," he began, his voice still infuriatingly level. "On Tuesday, one of your employees, acting on what I can only assume was a combination of personal prejudice and intense pressure to maintain a schedule, publicly humiliated me and had me removed by police from a flight for which I held a valid, confirmed first-class ticket. I will not deny that the experience was unpleasant." He let that sink in. He saw Sterling perk up, a flicker of hope in his eyes, thinking he had found his opening. But Nolan was just setting the stage. However, that incident was merely the initial data point. It was a symptom of the disease, not the disease itself. "My personal feelings are irrelevant. What is relevant is that the corporate culture that empowered that employee to act as she did appears to be the exact same culture that has allowed your maintenance division to systematically falsify safety logs and your operations division to actively instruct pilots to ignore potential mechanical failures in order to boost profits." He clicked the remote in his hand one last time. The final slide appeared on the massive screen behind him. It was the email, the Sterling Doctrine. The damning phrase was highlighted in a blood-red box. "The question for this board is not about my feelings," Nolan concluded, his voice dropping slightly but gaining an edge of steel. "The question is whether Mr. Sterling's philosophy, 'let's not let perfect be the enemy of profitable,' represents the official operating principle of Ascend Air. Because from where the Federal Aviation Administration is sitting, all the evidence suggests that it does." A dead, profound silence fell over the room. The email glowing on the screen was irrefutable. It was a tombstone. Richard Sterling stared at it, his mouth agape. He had been so proud of that phrase. Alan Maxwell read the email. He read it again. His face, already pale, turned ashen. He looked at Richard Sterling, not with anger, but with a kind of horrified pity, the look one gives a man who has just signed not only his own death warrant, but those of everyone around him. He slowly turned back to Nolan. His authority shattered his voice, barely a whisper. "Dr. Pierce, what happens now?" Nolan closed his laptop with a soft, final click. The audit was over. The judgment was about to begin. "Now," Nolan said, his voice carrying the full, crushing weight of his office, "we discuss the terms of the immediate grounding order for your entire 737 MAX fleet, the multi-million-dollar fines for each of the 117 violations I have documented, and the complete top-to-bottom FAA-mandated overhaul of your entire maintenance and safety protocol, which you will pay for." He then looked at Richard Sterling for the last time, his eyes devoid of any emotion at all. "And you will be clearing your schedule to speak with the Department of Justice." The fallout was not a gentle descent. It was a cliff dive onto concrete. It was far worse than a code Armageddon. It was a corporate extinction-level event, televised in real time. Acting on Nolan Pierce's meticulously detailed final report, the FAA didn't just levy a fine. They brought down a righteous hammer forged in the fire of public trust. Ascend Air was hit with a staggering $87.6 million penalty, a figure that made even seasoned Wall Street analysts whistle. It was a historic sum for systemic safety violations, maintenance fraud, and obstruction. Concurrently, the entire 737 MAX fleet, over 100 aircraft, the backbone of their domestic routes, was grounded. Each plane, now a silent multi-ton paperweight on the tarmac, became a fountain of hemorrhaging cash, costing the company millions each day in lost revenue, parking fees, and cancelled bookings. The news broke on a Thursday morning, and the market reacted with the brutal, impersonal swiftness of a guillotine. Ascend Air's stock ticker, ASC, became a waterfall of red. It plummeted 42% by midday, wiping out billions in shareholder value. News channels smelling blood went into a feeding frenzy. Grim-faced aviation experts discussed the findings on endless loops, often using Nolan's term, "a culture of lies," as a chilling, ready-made headline. Inevitably, the story of the audit's origin, the ugly confrontation at the boarding gate, leaked to the press, adding an irresistible narrative of karmic justice to the dry facts of corporate malfeasance. Dr. Nolan Pierce, a man who cherished his anonymity, became an overnight and very reluctant public figure, a symbol of quiet integrity, standing against both casual prejudice and calculated corporate greed. Richard Sterling was fired, of course, but that was merely the opening act of his personal tragedy. The Department of Justice, armed with the damning trove of evidence Nolan had meticulously compiled, unsealed a federal indictment. The charges were severe conspiracy to defraud the United States, wire fraud, and endangering the safety of aircraft. His infamous email, "Let's not let perfect be the enemy of profitable," was Exhibit A, a monument to his own hubris. His tailored Italian suits and Swiss watches were replaced by the grim reality of consultations with a high-priced criminal defense team. His future was no longer about stock options and quarterly bonuses. It was about federal sentencing guidelines and the possibility of trading his corner office for a jail cell. The CEO, Alan Maxwell, who had floated above the messy details of operations, was swiftly forced to resign by a panicked board, desperate to signal a new chapter. He left with a tarnished golden parachute, a wealthy man, whose legacy would forever be stained by the scandal that had metastasized under his detached leadership. Back in Washington, D.C., in a quiet office overlooking the city, Nolan Pierce was debriefing his director. There were no celebrations, no victory laps. The weight of their responsibility was a tangible presence in the room. "You did good work," Nolan, the director, said, his voice heavy. "Difficult work." "It was necessary work," Nolan replied, his gaze distant. "I just wish it hadn't been." He thought then of Karen Miller. He had learned through back channels that after her termination, she had struggled to find another job in the airline industry. Her name associated with the scandal's flashpoint was now informally blacklisted. A strange, unexpected sliver of pity pricked at him. She was the first domino, a product of a toxic system that rewarded her worst impulses. She had acted out of ignorance and pressure, a pawn in a much larger game, while men like Sterling had acted out of calculated cynical greed. Both were dangerous, but the architect of the system was undeniably more sinister than the cog. Weeks bled into months. Ascend Air, under a completely new and humbled leadership team, began the long, painful, and astronomically expensive process of rebuilding from the studs. They brought in external consultants to help them purge the Sterling doctrine from their corporate DNA. They completely restructured their maintenance division, investing in new oversight and technology. They launched a mandatory company-wide training program focused not just on safety culture, but pointedly on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Their new slogan, plastered across airports in a somber blue font, was "Safety and Respect, on the ground and in the air." It was a promise born from the ashes of a near-fatal fire. 6 months after the audit, Nolan found himself at an airport again. Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta this time, a chaotic symphony of human movement. He was flying to a conference, another routine trip in a life of quiet vigilance. As he stood in the Group 1 boarding lane for a different airline, he found himself watching the gate agent for an Ascend Air flight at the adjacent gate. She was a young woman, and she was performing her duties with a kind of focused diligence that felt new. She was meticulously scanning every single boarding pass, looking each passenger in the eye and offering a small, genuine smile. When a family with 2 loud, restless children seemed flustered, juggling bags and strollers, the agent didn't show a flicker of impatience. Instead, she paused the line, stepped out from behind the podium, and helped them organize their things, speaking to the parents with a calm, reassuring tone. Nolan saw a small, almost imperceptible change in procedure, but it was there. A flicker of diligence. A hint of a lesson learned the hard way. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was a text from Captain Dave O'Connell. The message contained a single photo, a brightly lit maintenance hangar, where a team of mechanics and FAA inspectors in yellow vests were swarming over the fuselage of an Ascend Airjet. The caption below it read, simply, "They're finally listening, thanks to you." Nolan put his phone away as his own boarding group was called, a faint smile touching his lips. He walked down the jet bridge, found his seat, and settled in for the flight. He didn't feel like a hero. He was just a man who did his job. A man whose job, on one fateful Tuesday, had intersected with a moment of casual ugliness. And through sheer relentless professionalism, he had followed that single ugly thread until the entire rotten tapestry of lies unraveled at his feet. The plane took off, climbing steeply into the vast blue sky. Below him, The world was a patchwork of interconnected systems, all built on rules and procedures and, most importantly, on trust. And he, Dr. Nolan Pierce, was one of the quiet guardians, a man in a simple suit, making sure that for the millions of people who put their faith in those systems every day, the trust was not misplaced. The karma had been hard, swift, and absolute, but it had also been necessary. It had cleared the air. The story of Dr. Pierce and Ascend Air is a powerful reminder that the smallest moments of injustice can be symptoms of much larger, more dangerous problems. It wasn't just about one man being disrespected. It was about a corporate culture where cutting corners had become standard practice from the boarding gate to the maintenance bay. The hard karma that hit Ascend Air wasn't just punishment, it was a life-saving course correction for all of us who fly. It shows that one person, armed with integrity and quiet resolve, can hold immense power accountable. What do you think? Was this the ultimate case of workplace karma? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe for more true stories of drama justice and the powerful forces that shape our world. Fly safe. The story of Dr. Pierce and Ascend Air is a powerful reminder that the smallest moments of injustice can be symptoms of much larger, more dangerous problems. It wasn't just about one man being disrespected. It was about a corporate culture where cutting corners had become standard practice from the boarding gate to the maintenance bay. The hard karma that hit Ascend Air wasn't just punishment, it was a life-saving course correction for all of us who fly. It shows that one person, armed with integrity and quiet resolve, can hold immense power accountable. What do you think? Was this the ultimate case of workplace karma? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe for more true stories of drama justice and the powerful forces that shape our world. Fly safe.